Thank you very much for that. Okay, so just a reminder about the feedback forms, if you can fill them in as we go along. The second company to speak this evening is Shield Therapeutics. This is a commercial stage company delivering specialty products. The initial focus is on an iron deficiency treatment. The FDA has approved this drug for a pretty broad indication, opening up a market in the US which is currently worth something over $1 billion a year. And we're expecting a US partnership deal sometime this year. On the financial side, the company's got a cash runway well into 2021, even without a US deal. Market cap is £166 million, or it was when I put this together a few days ago. And we're very fortunate to have Carl Sterrett, the CEO, as our speaker this evening.
Thank you very much, Keith. You've just given all the highlights away. Okay, good evening, everybody. There we go. Okay, so I'm Carl Sterrett. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the CEO and founder of the business. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I was sort of half expecting to walk into a fairly quiet room, actually, so this is very reassuring. Okay, so we are an AIM-listed biopharma company, ticker STX, around about 150 million, give or take. Obviously, the markets are a bit chaotic at the moment, which the value of which is really underpinned by our European and China transactions with Norgine and ASK. I'm going to focus a little bit on the China transaction because I think it's probably gone a little bit under the water since it got announced. Plus, there's obviously a substantial upside from a US transaction that we're working hard to get over the line at the moment. So our primary focus, as mentioned by Keith, is Ferrocru or Acrifer. It's a treatment for iron deficiency anemia. Actually, it's been approved for iron deficiency, which is a much broader indication, which is relevant because if you treat the iron deficiency, you stop the anemia, and the anemia market alone, globally, is probably worth $3.5 billion a year, of which most of it is driven by intravenous products, and a couple of them at that. So approved in all the major markets now, Europe and the US, also approved in Switzerland, with work going on in some other markets. The drug is supported by 3 positive phase 3 studies in different indications and different types of studies. There's 2 placebo-controlled studies and also a comparator study to the leading IV product. And as I mentioned, we've already started the out-licensing process in 2 of the markets. We also have, we're not a one-trick pony, we also have a second product in development, which is a treatment for a complication of renal disease. So patients who have late-stage chronic kidney disease or have moved on to dialysis will have a problem of retaining phosphate. And phosphate is in pretty much everything that you consume, in literally almost in your tea or your coffee, but certainly your ham sandwich, all those types of things. And if you've got healthy kidneys, you just get rid of the phosphate very simply. But if you don't have healthy kidneys, you end up retaining the phosphate. That gets deposited in your blood vessels and leads to an additional risk of cardiovascular events, stroke and heart attack. So pretty much every single person who has end-stage renal disease will be on a phosphate binder, and it's quite a significant market opportunity. But the drugs are pretty awful, so it's not unusual for a patient to be maybe taking 15 to 20 tablets a day just for their hyperphosphatemia. And we have something we think is much simpler. We're a pretty straightforward company. We are about 20 people. We have a lot of experience in the business. Myself, I think when I first started Shield, I'd probably say I had about 20 years experience. I've got a little bit more now. Across the team, I'd say in the 6 of us who really control all of the major silos of the business, the major skill sets, there's probably knocking on 200 years of experience. We've been working for small pharma, biotech, big pharma, development, commercialization, the whole shebang, really. And as Keith said, we have plenty of cash out through next year. and that's without the US deal. Just a quick what's happened to the share price. You can see the big jump around July, August last year, which was related to the FDA approval. And we sort of maintained that for a while, and then we've had a bit of profit taking going on in the early part of this year, which of course has then been exacerbated by coronavirus and the furore around that, which is directly in line with all of our peers, really. I think clearly it presents an opportunity for buyers. And if I compare that, or if I move that across to where the valuations are from the various analysts who cover us, you can get a sense here of where we sit and the potential upside, even just based into the European and China transactions that we have completed. The slide deck is available, so I'm not going to stand on this for a long time, but you can see very clearly analyst targets are much higher than current market cap. And there's clearly further upside in that, particularly with the US deal. Okay, so let's just focus a little bit on China, though, because I think China is the future. And there are really significant structural changes going on in the Chinese healthcare system that create opportunity, especially for proprietary medicines. So we have done we agreed an exclusive license, announced an exclusive license with a company called ASK. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce their Chinese name. But they're a pretty substantial company that we'd never heard of before we started our process in China. It led to an $11.4 million upfront payment, which will be mirrored with Chinese approval. And there'll be different ways to get approval, and I'll touch on that in a second. Up to a further $40 million in sales milestones and tiered royalties range from 10 to 15% of net sales. Plus, of course, they also pay for the product. They are responsible for all clinical and regulatory activities, and of course the manufacture, and of course the commercialization of the product. So no costs fall to us in this as well. Why ask? So they're not a particularly old company, but China's been going through just a constant revolution, really, economically. They're listed on the Shenzhen market. It was important for us that when we first went to China and started looking around and talking to companies, it felt like a little bit like the Wild West. Very hard to understand the history of these companies, so we decided that we would really only focus on companies that had a public listing. And as you can see, we've ended up doing a deal with a Shenzhen-listed business, about $2.2 billion market cap. They have about $500 million, $600 million in sales annually. 2,500 people, of which about 1,000 of them are sales reps. So they can clearly get into the market for us as well, with a focus on GI and oncology. Both are our key areas for iron deficiency anemia. Getting the drug approved in China could form one of two routes, really. The simple way is the Chinese authorities accept the European approval and the US approval, and they allow us just to do a bioequivalence study, but they accept all the efficacy and safety data that we've generated already. And that would be probably a process that would take maybe a year and a half. Conservatively, we assume that the Chinese authorities will require a phase 3 study, which will probably take about twice as long. But again, there's no cost to us. It's just really the time to market. We'll probably have a better idea in the next 6 months of where the Chinese government sits. Everything obviously has gone into lockdown. The beginnings come out of hibernation. But they've locked down cities of, these guys are from Nanjing, a city of about 8 million people, and the streets were just deserted. Okay, the market opportunity. Why is China so attractive? Well, first of all, obviously it's the size, 1.4 billion people. It's thought that there are about 20% of the population are iron deficient, much higher than the Western world generally. Fair enough, many of them are in rural China, so if you just focus on the cities, if you assume that the cities have a higher rate, just work through, we expect a price similar to Europe, so around about €2 a day, give or take. Even with a 5% market share of the iron deficiency anemia market in China, you're looking at a potential for over $300 million of sales annually. If you take a bottom-up approach rather than that overall market approach and just look at where we've got some phase 3 data in IBD and CKD, so I guess you would refer to that maybe as the low-hanging fruit, Approximately 3 million patients have CKD or IBD and are suffering from anemia related to those diseases. And for CKD and IBD, anemia, so chronic kidney disease and inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's and colitis, and also celiac disease, those patients routinely have an iron deficiency anemia with their disease. If you assume that patients maybe use 6 packs a year, this is a drug that comes in 28-day packs, so it's 13 packs a year. You can see that anywhere between $1 billion, or if you go 6 to 12 packs, $1 billion to $2 billion. And if we take a 30% market share of just that CKD and IBD market, you're up to $300 million a year again. And there's lots of progress to be made in China structurally. The Chinese government have made it very clear that they want proprietary medicines to come. They're providing better protection. There's always been a fear about IP, and we're clearly an IP-based business. But that is fundamentally changing. The generics market has disappeared within the last year. The Chinese government have cut the prices of generics by about 90%, which has removed a whole swathe of generics from the market. And it's just making it much more Western. They recognize, when you look at the Chinese universities, they're producing many, many novel chemical entities that they want patients in the West to use as they develop them. So there's got to be a quid pro quo around competition and also around protection. Just looking at the US market, obviously a much smaller patient population, looking at about 360 million people rather than 1.4 billion. About 9.5 million patients have an iron deficiency anemia, and you can see how it breaks out. GI indications, women's health, and chronic kidney disease really form the majority of the market opportunity. And there's probably about 2 or 3 times again having iron deficiency. So again, this is sort of the low-hanging fruit, the IDA population. What about some of the market dynamics? So obviously, the US is a very highly priced market. We would expect, if you look at the IV products, Europe to the US, generally you're looking at about 3 to 4 times the price in the US. The market, from a volume perspective, is overwhelmingly controlled by the orals. There's about 10 million prescriptions a year for oral iron therapies. And actually, the patients pay for those themselves. Even though it's prescription, the class is tier 1 medicines, so they're 100% copay. So even if they're $50, $100 a month, the patient pays for them. From a value perspective, it's overwhelmingly IV, even though they make up a tiny percentage of the overall prescriptions. Much higher price, and that's just the drug cost. On top of the drug cost, you have about the same again in treatment costs. So it's about $3,000, $4,000 a year in drug cost average per patient, and about the same again. And they have a very significant copay on the administration, but not on the drug. And the market's growing very rapidly in the US, really driven by 2 products, 2 IV products. One called Injectafer from a Swiss company called Vifor, and an American company called AMAG with a product called Ferraheme. Injectafer is the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, though. This is a product, they've done a fantastic job of commercialization. If you think these are non-acute diseases, and they have developed a $1 billion market from an acute therapy, you have to go into hospital to have this treatment because of the risk of anaphylaxis, the risk of a peanut allergy type reaction, and people die from these products. There was recently a drug approved, another IV product approved in the US, which had a reported rate of 3 anaphylactic reactions per 1,000 injections. Now, 3 doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're one of those patients, and there's about 1 million IV iron prescriptions a year in the US, that's not a nice thing to happen to you. So they have to be given in a hospital with all the concomitant protection. Now, we have a product that has comparative data to IV iron, or non-inferiority data is the technical term. So we've shown that Ferrocru can provide the same benefit to patients with regard to their hemoglobin levels and their iron levels without any of the risk and without having to go back into hospital for repeat therapy. So we think this presents a huge opportunity for Ferrocru. Just touch on what the disease is. So iron deficiency, obviously it's about conserving hemoglobin. Primarily, that is the ultimate aim of the body to conserve hemoglobin to be able to carry oxygen. But actually, iron is involved in a whole range of things. So by the time the patient is actually anemic, they've been iron deficient for a long time and they've got all sorts of problems. None of them are going to kill them. These are not acute issues, but they lead to significant morbidity, significant economic impact, recognized by payers. It only occurs in two ways: when you either don't absorb enough iron, perhaps through your diet, or perhaps because you have a disease that prevents absorption of dietary iron, or through blood loss. So often CKD patients, for example, will suffer from both ends, that they'll find it difficult to absorb because they've got systemic inflammation, but also they will lose blood through their CKD issues. And it attacks a whole range of issues, from being elderly and having less acid in your stomach, which makes it hard to absorb iron, all the way through to those chronic diseases I've mentioned. So why is Ferrocru so different? So there's lots and lots of iron tablets out there, but unfortunately, the vast majority of them are salt-based. So they have an iron attached to something in the gut that has to separate out because it's too big to be absorbed. And in that separation, you simply get lots of free iron in the gut. Now, that iron is highly reactive, lots of energy, and it either agglomerates together and causes constipation and discomfort and can't be absorbed, or it gets involved in something called a redox cycle, which causes lots of free radicals to be produced. And those free radicals in the gut cause pain, inflammation, and lack of absorption in the end. Ferrocru is not a salt. It's a covalently bound product that uses a ferric ion with 3 small sugar-like molecules called maltol. And they are able to repel everything else away from them in the gut to stop the iron becoming free. If the patient is not iron deficient, it just passes through them safely. If they are iron deficient, the more iron deficient they are, the more they absorb. However, you don't get overdose with this drug either, whereas you can with excessive IV iron infusions. So it carries all the benefits of convenience of oral, but also significant safety as well. Fully patent protected across a range of elements to the product. Okay, sorry. Okay, so what happens? Generally, patients get diagnosed with iron deficiency, and they are given one of these salts. They're cheap, they're cheerful, and if you're one of the patients for whom they work, you don't get all the stomach upset, brilliant. That's what I would take. But if you are one of the patients with lots of stomach upset from these drugs, you need something else. And why would you go to hospital for an IV infusion? And this is where obviously now Ferrocru can sit in the treatment algorithm. I'll just touch on where we are with commercialization. This is in our trading update from about a month or so ago. So at the moment, Norgine are commercializing the product in Germany and in the UK, specifically England, whilst they are markets that are price-taking rather than price-giving. The rest of the European market generally is price-giving, so you have to go through a whole range of pricing and reimbursement, and that really required the head-to-head data that I talked about earlier. We had that data around the middle of last year, so now Norgine are going through this tortuous process of seeking pricing and reimbursement in all those other European markets. However, in the markets they've been working in, we're starting to see quite encouraging growth. They have many more reps than we were ever able to employ into this space. So you can start to see that we're now getting quarter-on-quarter growth. And finally, I'll just touch on the US. We know it's got a very broad label in the US, and it's a big market. Where are we on the out-licensing process? So we are working with a sector-specific US advisor that works exclusively in the healthcare franchise. We've done a large outreach process to a whole range of companies that may be interested in different types of structure, of commercial structure, with Shield as a partner. And we're now down to a short list of multiple interested parties, and we're in detailed discussions around due diligence, et cetera, as we look to get one of those deals over the line. I'm not going to put a time frame on it. I think it's one of those things, we will do it as quickly as we possibly can. We realize fundamentally how important it is for us as an organization. Okay, at that, I think I'll draw it to a close and take some questions.
On the out-licensing in the States, are you planning to get the same royalty stream as you're achieving in China? And is that, because it seems quite an attractive royalty stream?
So I would expect the royalty in the US to be somewhere between China and Europe. So the European royalty ranges between 25 and 40% of net sales. In China, it ranges between 10 and 15%. Now, that's a couple of reasons for that. China obviously has to put all the effort into getting the drug approved, and they may have to do a study. Whereas we handed over an approved product in Europe. So I'd expect it to be somewhere in the middle.
Could you comment on the mechanics of distribution? How is this drug adopted? How difficult will it be to oust the incumbent drugs, although you appear to have a technical advantage in practice? How do you dislodge them?
Sure. So from a manufacturing and distribution perspective, we use contract manufacturers. Our main manufacturer of finished product is a global organization called Patheon, and we use a facility right now that's just outside of Lyon. The drug substance is the ferric maltol is very, very, very stable. We have product out to 5 years that just doesn't change. And then the drug product at the moment has a shelf life of 21 months. So combining the two, you have around about 5 years to play with, and you call it off on a batch basis. If I think about Europe, there's a bunch of wholesalers that provide the product into, as the hospitals or as the pharmacies call on the drug, they routinely deliver on a daily or a weekly basis. So this just goes into the very, very well recognized infrastructure of distribution of prescription pharmaceuticals. Sorry, you asked me a second point. Yeah. So our positioning for this product, so I talked earlier, so if I take the US market with about 10 million prescriptions a year for iron therapy, of which about 11 million, about 10 million of those are for oral agents. Perhaps half of those patients fail those therapies through generally just through the inability to tolerate the issues with those drugs. Right now, only about 5 to 10% of those patients go to IV iron, and there's often a waiting period as well. So our first target, I think we've got 2 initial targets. Ignore the patients who are effectively treated with oral iron for a start. Using the head-to-head data, you go after the patients who are on IV therapy already and who are coming back for their next infusion. If you look at the data in our head-to-head study, there's approximately about an 88-day median time to next treatment for an IV patient. So they get about four treatments a year, which requires them to go into hospital each time for a couple of infusions, split by 2 or 3 days. So you've got an opportunity to go in and say, before you treat that patient again with IV iron, here's an opportunity for you. Or the bigger opportunity is the patients who are untreated. So our focus is on, and if I look at how Norgine are doing this, our focus is on a specialty sales team who go after conversations with the specialist prescribers, so the consultant physicians, gastroenterologists, nephrologists, etc. And once they've adopted, you would then expect to see this wave of influence go down. This is pretty classic in this space. A wave of influence go down over the junior doctors and eventually into the primary care physicians. You think about primary care, this drug will probably end up in primary care in the long run. So your GP may have 3 or 4 patients who've got Crohn's disease or colitis who will have anemia, and they're quite difficult to treat. So you wouldn't go after the GPs, you wouldn't promote to the GP because of that small number of patients. However, those patients come back to the GP for their routine maintenance therapy, and this GP sees that their anemia has been resolved with a product like this, nice, simple oral product. He or she's actually probably got a few hundred patients with anemia. So we would expect to see the shoulders then grow within the primary care community. And if I look at the US, so somewhere in the region of 30% of the oral iron prescriptions are written by about 7,000 prescribers. And the beauties of the US market is the data analysis is really granular. So you can go all the way down to either the insurance claim or the prescriber, so you can see who is prescribing. So 7,000, I mean, that's 7,000 physicians accounting for 30% of the oral prescribing is a very, very attractive market.
I can see you have a functional benefits over the Theracue does over its US equivalent. Number one, cost per treatment. Do you also have a cost advantage? And secondly, how long will it take before you get FDA approval for Theracue in the US?
Okay, so the last one first, Theracue is approved. So it got approved in the second half of last year, which is why we're now going through the licensing, commercialized partnership discussions. Sorry, your first part of your question, my apologies.
Yeah. Do you also have a cost benefit over the US equivalent?
Yeah, so if I take the oral therapies, such as the iron salts, ferrous sulfate, ferrous fumarate, they're all generic. They've been around forever. They're equivalent of pennies a day rather than Theracue in Europe is about €2 a day. We'd expect Theracue to be maybe $8 a day in the US, and that is priced at a point that's about equivalent to the average use of IV iron through a year. So they would take our drug on a daily basis. They would take IV iron about 4 times a year. You get about the same cost of $3,000 to $3,500 a year per patient, gross. On top of that for IV, every time the patient has an infusion, which if they're having 4 treatments a year, it's 8 infusions, it's about $500 an infusion. So the aim here is that Theracue, for the overall treatment cost, Theracue will be about half of the product it would be marginalizing. So it provides the commercial payers with a significant advantage, and the commercial payers in the US account for the vast majority of the market opportunity. Oh, the UK. So there are 2 ways to go around getting reimbursement in the UK. You either go down the NICE route and get a recommendation, hopefully positive, or you go and talk to each of the hospitals. Now, there's a preconception that with NICE, if NICE makes a recommendation, then it's a mandate to all of the CCGs, the bodies that hold the money, that they must pay for this product. It's not the case at all. If it's a life-saving therapy, if there's some central doctrine, yes, that can work. But unfortunately, NICE makes recommendations only. So for a product like Theracue, the time it takes, you've got to go into a queue for NICE to consider a review, or you can pay NICE to review it. You then obviously run the risk of them saying, we don't think it's cost effective. No, we don't think that's the case with this product. But putting all of that into context, as the small company that we are, we decided that we would avoid the NICE process and start targeting the bigger units in the UK. So, for example, in the northeast of England, there's something called the Northern Therapeutic Advisory Group. Now, that's a collection of CCGs that cover everything from the Scottish borders down to the Darlington area in the northeast quadrant of the UK. And they make one recommendation that is adopted by all of their members. So they've recommended that Theracue can be used in patients who've failed existing oral therapies before they go on to intravenous iron. And that's a significant, and the same in the London network as well. So we've tried to focus on the areas of the UK where there are big collections of payer groups. And we've stayed away from, and this is unfortunate, it leads to some patients not getting access to therapy, but you stay away from the smaller hospitals or the smaller CCGs that are not part of a consortium, and they will come later. One more? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Things like counterfeiting.
Could you just use the microphone, please? Sorry.
How do you deal with things like counterfeiting?
Counterfeiting. So obviously the drug is manufactured in a controlled environment. It's a prescription. Each product gets its own unique identifier. And generally, if a patient starts to take a drug that is counterfeited, then they're not going to respond to hemoglobin. You know, hemoglobin is something that is just not a placebo effect. So I don't think you can necessarily stop it coming into the market, but then you can try to identify it if it does. In reality, it's not a problem that we're going to face until we have a product that is really significantly commercially successful, because there are far, far more targets for counterfeiters to go after right now.